The red-eye flight from Seattle to Boston had drained every ounce of energy from my body. After 2 weeks of back-to-back meetings, endless PowerPoint presentations, and forced small talk with clients, all I wanted was to curl up in my own bed in our cozy Cambridge apartment. The Uber driver had been unusually chatty during the 40-minute ride from Logan International, and I'd forced myself to stay awake and respond with occasional hms while dreaming of a hot shower and my memory foam pillow. The familiar brick facade of our Victorian-style building on Magazine Street should have been a welcome sight, but something felt off the moment I wheeled my carry-on toward the entrance. Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor who usually tended to her window boxes at this hour, gave me an odd look from behind her geraniums. There was sympathy in her eyes, mixed with something else, concern, maybe? I brushed it off as exhaustion-induced paranoia. The moment I inserted my key into the lock, an unfamiliar scent wafted through the gap under the door. Instead of the vanilla and sandalwood blend I'd left diffusing in the living room, a cloying mixture of lavender and rose assaulted my nostrils. My stomach dropped. Tom, my husband of 4 years, knew I was allergic to lavender. We'd had countless conversations about it during our wedding planning when his mother, Margaret, had insisted on lavender centerpieces. I pushed open the door, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. Our carefully curated minimalist decor had been transformed into what looked like a Victorian parlor threw up in my living room. Doilies, actual, honest-to-God doilies, covered every surface. The sleek gray sectional I'd saved 6 months to buy was buried under a mountain of floral throw pillows. Family photos I'd never seen before dominated the walls, most featuring Tom as a child with his mother hovering protectively over him. The sound of pots and pans clanging in the kitchen snapped me out of my shock stupor. As I moved toward the noise, my designer heels, a splurge after landing a major client, sank into a plush oriental rug that definitely hadn't been there when I left. The hardwood floors I'd spent weekends refinishing were barely visible beneath the new decor. The sight that greeted me in the kitchen made me wonder if I'd accidentally walked into an alternate dimension. Margaret Wellington, my mother-in-law, stood at my beloved Viking range, another carefully budgeted purchase, stirring something in my Le Creuset Dutch oven. She wore a frilly apron that looked like it had time-traveled from the 1950s, her steel gray hair perfectly coiffed despite the steam rising from whatever she was cooking. She turned at the sound of my heels, and the smile she gave me didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, dear," she said, her Boston Brahmin accent more pronounced than ever. "I thought you'd never get home. Tommy's been surviving on takeout, poor thing. But don't worry, Mother's here now." I gripped the handle of my suitcase so hard my knuckles turned white. Tommy. She always called him Tommy, even though everyone else had called him Tom since prep school. The diminutive name was her way of keeping him eternally 12 years old, her precious baby boy who could do no wrong. "Margaret," I managed to say through gritted teeth. What a surprise. The words tasted like acid in my mouth. I wasn't expecting company. The last word came out strangled as I noticed she'd replaced my organized spice rack with what appeared to be antique spice jars, complete with yellowing handwritten labels. She waved a wooden spoon dismissively, splattering what smelled like beef stew onto my freshly painted walls. "Oh, this isn't a visit, dear. I've moved in to help put things in order." "Clearly, you're too busy with your career," she said the word like it was a communicable disease, "to maintain a proper home for my Tommy." The room started spinning. I'd dealt with Margaret's passive-aggressive comments at holidays, her constant criticism of my working instead of settling down properly to give her grandchildren, her not-so-subtle digs about my modest background compared to the Wellington family's old money. But this was a whole new level of boundary crossing. I heard the front door open and close, followed by familiar footsteps. Tom appeared in the kitchen doorway, his Brooks Brothers suit slightly rumpled from a day at the law firm. His eyes met mine, and I saw guilt flash across his face before he attempted a casual smile. "Hey, honey," he said, loosening his tie. "How was Seattle?" The normalcy of his greeting, as if nothing was amiss, as if his mother hadn't staged a hostile takeover of our home, made something snap inside me. The exhaustion of travel, the shock of the invasion, and 4 years of swallowing my reactions to Margaret's behavior collided in my chest. "How was Seattle?" I repeated incredulously. "How was Seattle?" "I don't know, Tom. Why don't you tell me about what's been happening in Boston while I was gone? Like, for instance, why your mother has apparently moved into our home without anyone bothering to consult me." Margaret clucked her tongue, stirring her stew with renewed vigor. "Now, Sarah, there's no need for hysteria. Tommy and I discussed this thoroughly. The apartment above my brownstone in Beacon Hill is being renovated, and he agreed it made perfect sense for me to stay here. After all, family helps family." I stared at Tom, waiting for him to contradict her, to say this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably and said, "Mom needed a place to stay for a few weeks, and I thought you wouldn't mind. It's temporary. Wouldn't mind? Wouldn't mind?" The woman who'd spent our entire wedding planning process trying to convince her son he was making a mistake, who'd given a reception speech that included the phrase, "There's still time to change your mind," who'd spent 4 years treating me like an intruder in her family, was now living in my home. And my husband thought I wouldn't mind? I looked around my kitchen. No, not my kitchen anymore. Margaret had transformed it into her domain in less than 2 weeks. My carefully organized drawers were now chaos, filled with gadgets I'd never use. The refrigerator was plastered with maternal magnets holding recipes for Tommy's favorites. Even my coffee station, my sacred morning ritual space, had been replaced with an ancient percolator that looked like it belonged in a museum. The rage building inside me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just about the unauthorized redecorating or the invasion of my space. This was about respect, or rather, the complete lack of it. In one fell swoop, both. My husband and his mother had demonstrated exactly how little they valued my position in this family, in this marriage, in my own home. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again. The words trying to escape weren't ones that should be said in anger, no matter how justified that anger might be. Instead, I turned on my heel, dragging my suitcase behind me as I headed for my home office, the one room Margaret apparently hadn't gotten to yet. "Sarah," Tom called after me. "Where are you going?" "Mom made enough stew for everyone." I paused in the doorway but didn't turn around. "I have work to do," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Enjoy dinner with your mother." As I closed and locked the office door behind me, I heard Margaret's voice drift down the hallway. "You see, Tommy? This is what happens when a woman prioritizes her career over her family. She doesn't even want to sit down to a proper meal." I leaned against the door, sliding down until I sat on the floor, my designer suit crumpled around me. Through the haze of jet lag and fury, one thing became crystal clear. This situation couldn't stand. Not for a few weeks, not for a few days, not for another hour. War had been declared in my own home, and I'd be damned if I was going to lose. I spent an hour in my office, listening to the domestic sounds filtering through the door, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of Margaret's too loud laughter. My laptop remained closed on my desk. Despite my excuse about work, I couldn't focus on quarterly reports when my personal life was imploding. Instead, I sat in my ergonomic chair, another purchase Margaret had probably deemed unnecessarily extravagant, and scrolled through my phone, looking at photos from just 3 weeks ago. Tom and I at the harbor walk, his arm around my waist as we smiled into the camera. Us at the Red Sox game, sharing an overpriced beer and arguing playfully about my loyalty to the Yankees, a holdover from my New York upbringing that Margaret considered yet another character flaw. The pictures showed a happy couple, or at least I'd thought we were happy. A soft knock on the door interrupted my brooding. "Sarah." Tom's voice was hesitant. "Can we talk?" I took a deep breath, smoothed my silk blouse, and opened the door. Tom stood there looking apologetic, his tie completely removed now, top button undone. He'd always been handsome in that preppy New England way, sandy hair, strong jaw, the kind of face that belonged on a boat with a sweater tied around his shoulders. Right now, though, all I could see was his mother's influence in the uncertain set of his mouth, the way he seemed to be bracing for my reaction. "Oh, now you want to talk?" I stepped back to let him in, my voice low to avoid carrying down the hallway. Funny, you didn't seem interested in talking when you decided to move your mother into our home while I was away. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd once found endearing. Look, I know I should have discussed it with you first. But Mom's contractor called while you were gone, saying there was major water damage in her building. They had to gut the whole apartment above hers, and the work affected her place too. She needed somewhere to stay immediately. And a hotel was out of the question? I arched an eyebrow. The Wellingtons couldn't possibly slum it at the Four Seasons? Or maybe one of her bridge club friends couldn't offer their guest house. Because I know for a fact that Catherine Hammond has that lovely carriage house sitting empty. Tom had the grace to look embarrassed. She said it would be silly to spend money on a hotel when family could help out. And you know how Mom feels about imposing on friends. But imposing on me is perfectly fine. I walked to the window, looking out at the Cambridge Street below. The early evening foot traffic was picking up as students and professors headed home from Harvard's campus. Tom, your mother hates me. She's made that crystal clear from day one. And now you've given her free rein to take over our home. She doesn't hate you, he protested weakly. She's just traditional. And she worries about me. I turned back to face him, incredulous. Traditional? Is that what we're calling it? She's rearranged our entire apartment, Tom. She's replaced my things with her things. She's cooking in my kitchen like she owns it. And let's not forget the lovely greeting I got, basically calling me a failure as a wife because I dare to have a career. You're overreacting, he said, and I saw his mother's influence again in the dismissive tone. Mom's set in her ways, but she means well. This is temporary, just until her place is fixed up. Maybe a few weeks, a month at most. The words hit me like a physical blow. A month. I practically choked on the word. You thought I wouldn't mind your mother living here for a month? The woman who spent our entire engagement trying to convince you to marry Abigail Morton instead? That's ancient history, Tom said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Abby's married now, living in Connecticut. That's not the point. My voice rose despite my efforts to keep it down. The point is that your mother has never respected our marriage, never respected me, and now you've given her the perfect opportunity to mark her territory in our home. And you didn't even have the courtesy to discuss it with me first. From somewhere in the apartment, Margaret's voice carried down the hall. Tommy, the apple pie is ready, dear. Your favorite recipe, the one my mother taught me. I watched my husband's face, saw the way he instantly perked up at the mention of his childhood comfort food. The transformation was subtle, but telling. He was already shifting away from our confrontation, drawn back into his mother's orbit. We can talk more about this later, he said, already moving toward the door. Why don't you come have some pie? Mom's is amazing, you know. Maybe if you spent some time with her. Are you serious right now? I stared at him in disbelief. Your mother has staged a hostile takeover of our home, and you think pie is going to fix it. But he was already gone, heading toward the kitchen and his mother's culinary manipulation. I stood in my office doorway, watching him disappear around the corner, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of my marriage. This wasn't just about Margaret's unexpected residence. This was about Tom's complete inability, or unwillingness, to stand up to his mother. About his failure to consider my feelings, my comfort in my own home. About the realization that maybe, just maybe, I'd been fooling myself about the strength of our relationship. All along. I walked to my desk and sat down heavily in my chair. Through the wall, I could hear Margaret's voice again, probably serving Tom his pie, probably sitting across from him at my dining table, which she'd no doubt covered with one of her precious lace tablecloths, probably planning her next move in this psychological warfare. The breaking point wasn't just about this moment. It was about all the moments that had led here, every time Tom had dismissed my concerns about his mother's behavior as just her way, every time he'd expected me to smooth things over for the sake of family harmony, every time he'd chosen the path of least resistance rather than standing up for our marriage. I opened my laptop and began to type. Not work emails or reports, but notes. Important things I needed to remember, questions I needed to ask. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear, this situation required more than just a conversation. It required action. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Rachel. Landed safely? How's home? I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. We need to talk. Can you meet for coffee tomorrow? Rachel's response was immediate. Flower Bakery, 8 a.m.? What's wrong? Everything, I typed back. Absolutely everything. I set my phone down and listened to the domestic sounds from the kitchen, the clink of forks against plates, the murmur of conversation, Margaret's laugh that somehow managed to sound both melodious and smug. From anyone else's perspective, it probably sounded like a lovely family evening. But I knew better. This was the sound of my marriage cracking apart, of trust being eroded by 1,000 little betrayals, of a man choosing his mother's comfort over his wife's respect. And underneath it all was the sound of my own anger, building like a storm about to break. Tomorrow, I would meet Rachel and start putting my plans in motion. Tomorrow, I would begin to take back control of my life and my home. Tomorrow, I would show both Tom and Margaret exactly what happened when they pushed me too far. But tonight, I sat in my office, my last remaining sanctuary, and mourned the death of my illusions about my marriage. The next morning, I left the apartment before either Tom or Margaret stirred. The thought of facing another passive-aggressive breakfast was more than I could handle. Instead, I walked the few blocks to Flower Bakery, where Rachel was already waiting with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a concerned expression. Rachel had been my roommate at NYU, and unlike many college friendships, ours had only grown stronger over the years. When I'd taken the job in Boston, she'd followed 6 months later for a position at Mass General. Now, as she pushed a vanilla latte toward me, her dark eyes scrutinized my face with the professional assessment of an ER doctor. "You look like hell," she said bluntly. "Spill." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup and told her everything: the surprise homecoming, Margaret's takeover, Tom's betrayal. Rachel's expression darkened with each detail, her normally cheerful face settling into the same look she got when dealing with particularly difficult patients. "That manipulative witch," she muttered when I finished. "And Tom. God, Sarah, I knew he had mother issues, but this is next level. What are you going to do?" I pulled out my phone and opened my notes from the previous night. "That's why I needed to talk to you. I have a plan, but I need your help thinking it through." I spent half the night researching my options. Rachel leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. "I'm listening." "First thing I did was check all our property documents," I said, keeping my voice low despite the morning bustle of the bakery. "The apartment is in my name only. We talked about adding Tom to the deed after the wedding, but with his student loans, we decided to keep it separate to protect the property. He never pushed the issue." "Smart move," Rachel nodded. "Legally speaking, that gives you a lot of power." "Exactly." I also went through our prenup, which Margaret hated. Rachel interjected with a small smile. "Which Margaret hated," I agreed, but Tom's father insisted on it to protect the family trust. The irony is, it actually protects me in this situation. There's nothing in it about housing obligations or family accommodations. Legally, I have every right to decide who lives in my home. Rachel's smile widened. "So you're going to evict her?" "I'm going to do it by the book," I said, scrolling through my notes. "I already called my cousin Michael this morning. You remember, the one who practices real estate law in New York? He's sending me some documents and connecting me with a colleague here in Boston. I want everything to be perfectly legal." "But what about Tom?" Rachel asked softly. "This is going to force his hand." I set my phone down and met her eyes. Maybe it's time we both stopped pretending this marriage is what I thought it was. I love Tom, I do. But I can't spend the rest of my life being the third wheel in my own marriage. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you need, I'm here. Guest room's already made up if you need a place to crash." "Thanks, but I'm not leaving my home." "That's exactly what Margaret wants." I took a sip of my cooling coffee. "I have another favor to ask, though. Can you come over tonight? I might need a witness and, honestly, some moral support." "Just try to keep me away," Rachel grinned. "What time should I arrive for the showdown?" I checked my calendar. Tom has a partner's dinner tonight at the firm. He'll be home late. Margaret usually watches her shows until 10. Come by around 9:30. I want to have everything in place. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. I met with Catherine Chin, Michael's colleague, during my lunch break. She reviewed my documentation and helped me draft the necessary papers. Then I made a few more strategic calls to our building manager, to the local police precinct, to my own company's HR department to arrange a few days of emergency leave if needed. By the time I returned to the apartment that evening, I felt armored in preparation. Margaret was in the living room, watching one of her beloved British dramas, and barely acknowledged my entrance. Tom had already left for his dinner, after sending me a text that read only, "Hope you're feeling better about everything. We'll talk soon." I locked myself in my office again, but this time I wasn't hiding. I was preparing. I spread the documents Catherine had helped me prepare across my desk, reviewing each one carefully. I had everything I needed: proof of ownership, notice of trespassing forms, even a temporary restraining order if things got ugly. At precisely 9:30, my phone buzzed with Rachel's text, "Outside your building. Ready when you are." I took a deep breath and gathered my papers. This wasn't how I'd imagined spending my first night back from a business trip, but sometimes life forces your hand. I'd given Tom the chance to handle this reasonably. I'd given Margaret the opportunity to show some basic respect. They'd both chosen to ignore the boundaries of my home and my marriage. Now it was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. I opened my office door and walked to the living room, where Margaret sat ensconced in what used to be my favorite reading chair. She looked up as I entered, her expression shifting from annoyance at being interrupted to something more calculating. "Finally decided to join the family, dear?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Though I suppose working late is more important to you than spending time with your mother-in-law." "Actually, Margaret," I said, my voice steady, "we need to talk about your living situation." She turned back to her show. "There's nothing to discuss. Tommy and I have already arranged everything." "That's where you're wrong." I moved to stand between her and the television. "This is my home, Margaret. My name is on the deed. My money paid for it. And I never agreed to you living here." She sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. "How do you speak to me like this? I am your husband's mother." "Yes, you are. But this isn't your home, and you have no right to be here without my permission." I held up the papers in my hand. "I have documentation proving my ownership, and I'm formally requesting that you leave." Margaret's face flushed red. "You cannot be serious. Tommy would never allow this. Tom doesn't have the legal right to allow or disallow anything regarding this property." I heard the front door open and Rachel's familiar footsteps in the hallway. "I've already spoken with the building manager and the local police. You have two choices, Margaret. You can leave voluntarily tonight, or I can have you removed as a trespasser. Your decision." Rachel appeared in the doorway, her presence solid and reassuring. Margaret's eyes darted between us, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "This is ridiculous," she finally sputtered. "I'm calling Tommy right now." "Go ahead," I said calmly. "But it won't change the facts. This is my property, and you are not welcome here. You have 1 hour to pack your things before I call the police." Margaret stood, trembling with rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Tommy will never forgive you." I met her gaze steadily. "Maybe not. But I'll never forgive myself if I don't stand up to you now." For a moment, we stood in silence, the British drama still playing softly in the background. Then Margaret turned and stormed toward the guest room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors I'd so carefully restored. Rachel moved to stand beside me. "You okay?" I nodded, though my hands were shaking slightly. I've never been better. And surprisingly, it was true. For the first time since walking into my transformed apartment, I felt in control. Whatever happened next, with Margaret, with Tom, with my marriage, at least I was finally standing up for myself. "Help me pack her things?" I asked Rachel. She linked her arm through mine. "That's what friends are for." As we walked toward the guest room, I could hear Margaret on the phone, her voice shrill with indignation as she presumably called Tom. Let her call. Let her rage. The time for compromising my self-respect was over. The storm was about to break, but at least now I was the one controlling the lightning. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a perfect New England autumn day that belied the storm brewing in my apartment. Margaret had spent the night furiously packing, refusing any offers of help from Rachel or me, while repeatedly trying to reach Tom on his phone. The partners' dinner must have run late because he hadn't answered any of her calls. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing my plan with Rachel, who'd insisted on staying over. We'd camped out in my office, drinking coffee and preparing for what we knew would be an explosive confrontation. At precisely 8 a.m., I made the call I'd arranged with Officer James Chen at the local precinct. "They'll be here within the hour," I told Rachel, who was fixing us more coffee in my newly reclaimed kitchen. Sometime during the night, I'd restored my coffee station, packing away Margaret's ancient percolator with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. "How are you feeling?" Rachel asked, sliding a mug across the counter to me. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, breathing in the familiar scent of my preferred breakfast blend. Surprisingly calm. It's like, once I made the decision, everything became crystal clear. Speaking of clear, Rachel nodded toward the window. "Look who's coming." A police cruiser had pulled up outside our building, and 2 officers were stepping out. I recognized Officer Chen from my visit to the precinct yesterday, a tall, professional-looking man in his 40s. His partner was a younger woman with short blonde hair and an alert expression. Just then, the front door burst open, and Tom rushed in, still wearing his suit from yesterday, looking disheveled and frantic. "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" "Mom's been calling me all night, but my phone died at dinner," and he stopped short at the sight of Rachel and me calmly drinking coffee. "Why is Rachel here? And why are there police outside?" Before I could answer, Margaret emerged from the guest room, her face blotchy with anger and what might have been tears. "Tommy, thank goodness you're here. Your wife has lost her mind. She's trying to throw me out of my own son's home." The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime incongruous with the tension in the room. Rachel moved to answer it, letting in Officers Chen and Martinez. They took in the scene with professional detachment, Tom in his rumpled suit, Margaret in obvious distress, and me, still in my silk pajamas, but radiating calm determination. "Good morning," Officer Chen said, his voice neutral but authoritative. "We received a call about an unwanted occupant on the premises. This is ridiculous." Margaret burst out. "This is my son's home." Actually, I stepped forward, holding out the folder of documents I'd prepared. "This is my home. I have all the documentation here: deed, mortgage, property tax records. I am the sole owner of this property, and Mrs. Wellington is here without my consent." Officer Chin reviewed the papers carefully while his partner kept a watchful eye on everyone in the room. Tom moved to speak, but I held up my hand. "Before you say anything, Tom, you might want to review the ownership documents yourself. Remember when we decided not to add you to the deed because of your student loans? That means you have no legal right to invite anyone to live here without my permission." "But she's my mother," Tom protested, running his hands through his already messy hair. "Where is she supposed to go?" "The Four Seasons is lovely this time of year," Rachel muttered under her breath, earning a glare from both Tom and Margaret. Officer Chin looked up from the documents. "Everything appears to be in order, Mrs. Wellington. As you have been asked to leave by the legal property owner, you'll need to vacate the premises immediately." Margaret's face contorted with rage. "This is absurd. Tommy, do something." But Tom looked lost, his legal training finally kicking in as he realized the precarious position he was in. "Mom, maybe we should—" "Don't you dare take her side," Margaret shrieked, her carefully maintained Boston Brahmin composure cracking completely. "After everything I've done for you. I raised you alone after your father died. I put you through prep school and Harvard Law. I've sacrificed everything for you." "Mrs. Wellington," Officer Martinez stepped forward, her voice firm but professional. "Please lower your voice. You have 2 options here. You can leave voluntarily, or we can escort you out. Which would you prefer?" The reality of the situation seemed to finally sink in for Margaret. She drew herself up, attempting to salvage her dignity. "I'll need to pack my things." "You've had since last night to pack," I pointed out. Officer Chin, would you and Officer Martinez please ensure Mrs. Wellington only takes her own belongings? She's made several unauthorized changes to my home during her stay. The next hour was a study in controlled chaos. Under the officer's supervision, Margaret packed her remaining items, including all the doilies, family photos, and antique spice jars she'd brought in. Tom alternated between helping his mother and shooting bewildered, hurt looks in my direction. Rachel stayed by my side, a silent pillar of support as I watched my marriage potentially implode. Finally, Margaret stood by the door, surrounded by her luggage. She fixed me with a venomous glare. "You'll regret this. Tommy, you can't let her treat your mother this way." Tom looked between us, his face a mask of confusion and distress. "Sarah, please. Can't we talk about this?" "We could have talked about it 2 weeks ago," I said quietly. "Before you moved your mother into my home without my consent. Before you dismissed my feelings and ignored my right to feel comfortable in my own space. Actions have consequences, Tom." "This isn't over," Margaret spat, her mask of gentility completely gone now. "You've made a powerful enemy, young lady." Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Mrs. Wellington, please exit the building. Any further threats could be considered harassment." With one last dramatic huff, Margaret allowed the officers to escort her out. Through the window, I watched as they helped load her luggage into a taxi that had mysteriously appeared, probably Tom's doing. As the taxi pulled away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, even as another settled around my heart. Tom stood in the middle of our living room, looking lost among the gaps where his mother's things had been. "I can't believe you did this," he said finally. "She's my mother, Sarah." "And I'm your wife," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. Or at least, I thought I was. But wives get consulted about major decisions. Wives get their feelings considered. Wives get respect in their own homes. She needed a place to stay, and you needed to discuss it with me first. The calm I'd maintained all morning finally cracked. "This isn't about your mother needing a place to stay, Tom. This is about you consistently choosing her comfort over my rights. This is about you letting her disrespect me, disregard my boundaries, and take over my home. This is about you being her son first and my husband second, or maybe third or fourth." Rachel quietly slipped into my office, giving us privacy for what we all knew was coming. Tom sank onto the couch, his face in his hands. "I never meant to hurt you," he said softly. I couldn't say no to her. Not after everything she's done for me." "I know," I said, and I did know. I'd always known this about him, had seen it play out in smaller ways throughout our marriage. I just never thought it would come to this. But I can't live my life being second place in my own marriage. "What are you saying?" I looked around our apartment, my apartment, at the empty spaces where Margaret's presence had been, at the 4 years of memories we'd built here, at the future I'd thought we'd have. "I'm saying that maybe it's time we both admitted that this isn't working. That it hasn't been working for a while." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, Cambridge was coming to life. Students hurrying to morning classes, professors cycling past on their way to campus, the normal rhythm of life continuing while my world shifted on its axis. "I should go," Tom said finally, standing up. "I need to check on Mom." Of course he did. Even now, even here, that was his first thought. I watched him gather his briefcase and jacket, watched him pause at the door, watched him struggle to find words that might fix this. But there were no words, not anymore. We both knew it. After he left, Rachel emerged from the office. Without a word, she pulled me into a hug, letting me cry for everything I'd lost and everything I'd never really had. The aftermath of Margaret's forced departure spread through Boston's upper-crust social circles like wildfire. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with texts from mutual friends and acquaintances, each message more dramatic than the last. The Boston Brahmins had their scandal of the season, and I was its star. I spent the next few days holed up in my apartment, working remotely thanks to my understanding boss. Rachel brought me groceries and updates from the outside world, including the increasingly outrageous rumors circulating through the hospital where she worked. Apparently, according to Margaret's version of events, I had physically thrown her out onto the street and burned all her family heirlooms in some sort of pagan ritual. You have to admit, Rachel said, unpacking Thai takeout on my newly decluttered kitchen counter, the pagan ritual. Thing has style. Though I'm pretty sure those doilies weren't actually family heirlooms. I managed a weak laugh, picking at my pad Thai. Have you heard anything about Tom? Rachel's expression softened. He's staying at the Four Seasons. Apparently, Margaret got her wish about someone from the family staying there after all. The irony wasn't lost on me. I pushed my food away, suddenly not hungry. Has he said anything? Sarah, Rachel set down her chopsticks. You need to stop torturing yourself. You did the right thing. That woman was toxic, and Tom made his choice a long time ago. He just never had to face it until now. She was right, of course. The signs had been there from the beginning: Tom's inability to stand up to his mother, his constant need for her approval, the way he'd dismiss my concerns about her behavior. I'd just been too in love, too optimistic, too determined to make it work to see what was right in front of me. The doorbell rang, interrupting my brooding. Rachel and I exchanged glances. No one had visited since the incident except her. She moved to answer it while I stayed in the kitchen, my heart pounding. It was Catherine Hammond, Margaret's bridge club friend and one of the most influential socialites in Boston. She stood in my doorway in a perfectly tailored Chanel suit, her silver hair immaculate, her expression unreadable. "Sarah, dear," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I think it's time we had a chat." Rachel shot me a questioning look. I nodded, and she gathered her things, squeezing my hand as she left. Catherine settled herself at my dining table, her designer bag placed precisely beside her. "Margaret is staying with me," she announced without preamble. I offered her my carriage house, but she insisted on taking one of the guest rooms in the main house. Something about needing moral support during this difficult time. I remained silent, waiting. Catherine Hammond hadn't come here just to update me on Margaret's living arrangements. "You know," she continued, her voice taking on a contemplative tone, "I've known Margaret Wellington for 30 years. I was there when her husband died, leaving her with a 12-year-old Tommy and a mountain of debt that his gambling had accumulated. I watched her rebuild her life, maintain her social standing, put her son through the best schools. She's one of my dearest friends." She paused, fixing me with her shrewd blue eyes. "But she's also one of the most controlling, manipulative women I've ever met. And I'm on the board of 3 different charitable organizations, so that's saying something." I blinked, surprised by this turn in the conversation. Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "Margaret has been calling everyone in our social circle, painting you as some sort of modern-day Lady Macbeth. She's convinced half of Boston that you're a gold digger who's trying to destroy her relationship with her beloved son." Catherine's lips curved in a slight smile. "Of course, those of us who've known her longer recognize her particular brand of, let's call it creative storytelling." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, finding my voice at last. "Because, my dear, I want you to know that not everyone is buying her version of events. And because I have something you might find interesting." She slid the envelope across the table to me. "Did you know that Margaret's apartment isn't actually being renovated?" I stared at her. "What?" "Open the envelope." Inside were photographs, recent ones, judging by the dates stamped on them. They showed Margaret's Beacon Hill apartment building, looking exactly as it always had. No construction crews, no evidence of water damage, nothing to suggest any renovation work. "But," Tom said. Tom said what his mother told him to say, Catherine interrupted gently. "Margaret has been planning this move for months. She told me herself at Bridge Club last spring that she was worried about Tommy's marriage to you. Said you were too independent, too career-focused. She was convinced you were pulling him away from his family obligations." The pieces started falling into place. So she invented the renovation story. To create a situation where Tom would have to choose between you and her? "Yes," Catherine nodded approvingly. "She's played this game before, you know. Tommy's freshman year at Harvard, she suddenly developed mysterious health problems that required him to come home every weekend. Junior year abroad? Canceled because she couldn't bear to have him so far away. That girlfriend he had in law school? The one before you? Margaret made sure that relationship ended when the girl started talking about taking a job in New York after graduation. My head was spinning. How do you know all this? Margaret likes to talk, especially after a few glasses of sherry at Bridge Club. And unlike most of our social circle, I actually listen. Catherine stood, smoothing her skirt. You should also know that she's been calling Tom's law firm, trying to convince the senior partners that your unstable behavior might reflect poorly on them. She what? The rage I thought I'd processed came roaring back. Don't worry, dear. I had lunch with Howard Patterson, the managing partner, yesterday. Reminded him that my family's foundation provides substantial funding for their pro bono program. He assured me that Tom's position is secure, regardless of his personal situation. I stood as well, my mind racing. Why are you helping me? Catherine's expression softened slightly. Because 30 years ago, I was you. Different circumstances, same controlling mother-in-law, same passive husband. I chose to stay, to keep the peace, to maintain my social standing. I've regretted it every day since. She picked up her bag. You chose differently. That takes courage. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Margaret's been telling everyone that you're mentally unstable, that you need help. She's trying to build a case for Tom to claim emotional distress in the divorce. We haven't even discussed divorce yet, I protested. Catherine gave me a knowing look. Haven't you? Check your email. Tom's lawyer sent over preliminary paperwork this morning. Margaret convinced him to act quickly before you could take advantage of him any further. After she left, I sat at my computer, and sure enough, there was an email from Preston and Hayes, one of Boston's top divorce firms. Margaret's influence, no doubt, they usually handled old money divorces, protecting family fortunes from gold-digging spouses. I forwarded the email to my cousin Michael without reading it. Then I called Rachel. Remember when you said I needed a shark of a divorce lawyer? I said when she answered. I think it's time. That night, unable to sleep, I walked through my apartment, really looking at it for the first time since the confrontation. The spaces Margaret had briefly occupied felt different now, tainted not just by her presence, but by the revelation of her manipulation. She hadn't just invaded my home, she'd orchestrated an elaborate plot to drive a wedge between Tom and me, presumably hoping I'd be the one to leave. Instead, she'd overplayed her hand. Her schemes had brought everything into sharp focus, exposing the cracks in my marriage that I'd been trying to ignore. Tom's passive acceptance of her behavior, his inability to prioritize our relationship, his endless excuses for her manipulation, it all formed a pattern I couldn't unsee now. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. Can we talk? Please? I stared at the message for a long time before responding, through our lawyers. It was harsh, perhaps, but necessary. Catherine's revelations had made one thing clear. This wasn't just about a temporary living situation gone wrong. This was about a calculated attempt to destroy my marriage, led by a woman who had spent years manipulating her son's life to maintain her control over him. And Tom? Tom had let it happen. Maybe he'd been oblivious to her true motives, maybe he'd known on some level but couldn't face it. Either way, he'd chosen the path of least resistance, as he always did where his mother was concerned. I looked around my apartment, my home, and made a decision. Tomorrow, I would call a cleaning service to deep clean every surface, erasing the last traces of Margaret's presence. I would send Tom's things to the Four Seasons, and I would begin the process of reclaiming my life from the influence of the Wellington family drama. Let Margaret spread her rumors. Let Boston society whisper about the scandal. I had the truth, documented evidence of her manipulation, and, most importantly, my self-respect. The fallout wasn't over. It was probably just beginning. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt truly certain about my path forward. 2 weeks after Margaret's dramatic exit, I sat in my newly redecorated living room, surrounded by paint swatches and furniture catalogs. The space had been completely transformed. Gone were the last lingering traces of the Wellington family's influence, replaced by colors and textures that were entirely my own choice. Rachel lounged on my new sectional, different from both the one Margaret had covered in doilies and the one I'd had before. "I still think you should have gone with the emerald green velvet," she said, running her hand over the deep navy fabric. "Too dramatic," I replied, flipping through a catalog of area rugs. I wanted something calming. "Speaking of dramatic," Rachel sat up straighter, "have you heard the latest from the Wellington camp?" I set down the catalog. After Catherine Hammond's visit, I'd tried to stay away from the society gossip, but some news was impossible to avoid in Boston's interconnected social circles. Do I want to know? Probably not, but you should. Margaret's telling everyone that Tom's staying at the Four Seasons because you changed the locks and threw his clothes out onto the street. I couldn't help but laugh. I had his things professionally packed and delivered by a moving service, with an inventory list, which is exactly why nobody with sense believes her anymore. Rachel grinned. Catherine Hammond made sure of that. Did you know she hosted a lunch yesterday specifically to set the record straight? I hadn't known, but it didn't surprise me. Catherine had become an unexpected ally in the weeks since her visit, her influence helping to counter Margaret's attempts to destroy my reputation. It was a strange sort of karma, Margaret's own friend turning out to be my strongest defender in Boston society. My phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from my lawyer, Victoria Chin, Michael's recommendation and, as requested, an absolute shark in designer clothing. "Tom's lawyers want to schedule a mediation session," I read aloud. "They're pushing for next week. Are you ready for that?" Rachel asked softly. I thought about it. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of legal preparations, property negotiations, and emotional processing. Victoria had helped me document everything: Margaret's false renovation story, her attempts to interfere with Tom's job, her pattern of manipulation. We had a strong case for an equitable divorce settlement, especially given the prenup and my sole ownership of the apartment. "I think I am," I said finally. "It's time to end this properly." The next morning, I walked into Victoria's downtown office feeling nervous but determined. She greeted me with her characteristic efficiency, spreading documents across her massive desk. "Tom's lawyers are pushing for a quick, quiet settlement," she explained. "They're worried about Margaret's involvement becoming public record in court proceedings." I nodded. Catherine had hinted that the Wellington family's older generation, Tom's uncles and their wives, were becoming concerned about Margaret's behavior. Apparently, her very public meltdown and subsequent smear campaign had drawn unwanted attention to family dynamics they'd preferred to keep private. "What are they offering?" I asked. Victoria smiled her shark smile. "More than they need to, given the prenup. They want you to sign an NDA about Margaret's, let's call it temporary residence, in your home. They want to buy my silence? They want to protect the family reputation." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "It's actually a smart move on their part. The settlement they're offering is generous, and the NDA would only cover the specific incident with Margaret, not the divorce itself." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to refuse on principle. Why should I help protect Margaret's reputation after everything she'd done? But a larger part of me recognized that this was an opportunity to end things cleanly, to walk away with my dignity and financial security intact. "What do you think I should do?" Victoria spread out the proposed settlement terms. "Honestly? Take it. You get to keep the apartment, which you already owned anyway. They're offering to buy out your share of the vacation property in Cape Cod at above market value. Tom will take full responsibility for any remaining joint debts. And the NDA." She smiled again. "Well, let's just say it's narrowly worded enough that you could still write one hell of a memoir someday if you wanted to." A knock at the door interrupted us. Victoria's assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Wellington is here for his appointment." My heart jumped. I hadn't seen Tom since the day Margaret left, our communication restricted to lawyers and text messages. Victoria looked at me questioningly. "Give us a few minutes," I said, surprising myself as much as her. Tom looked terrible when he walked in, expensive suit, impeccably pressed as always, but with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted look on his face that reminded me of his expression during law school finals. He stopped just inside the door, hands shoved in his pockets. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi." I gestured to the chair across from me. "You wanted to talk?" He sat down carefully, like a man approaching a wild animal. "I've been seeing a therapist," he blurted out. "She's helping me understand some things about Mom. About patterns I never noticed before." I waited, letting him find his words. "I'm sorry," he continued. "Not just about Mom moving in without asking you, but about everything. About never standing up to her. About letting her manipulate situations. About not being the husband you deserved." "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means something." "I don't want a divorce," he said suddenly. "We could try counseling, work through this." "Tom," I interrupted gently, "your mother orchestrated this entire situation to try to drive me away from you. She lied about needing a place to stay. She deliberately took over our home to force a confrontation. And when it didn't work out the way she planned, she tried to destroy my reputation and your career." "I know," he whispered. "Catherine told the family everything." Mom's not well." My answer, trying to convince her to get help. "I'm glad she's getting help," I said sincerely. "But that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the fact that when pushed to choose, you chose her. You always have." "I'm working on that in therapy," he insisted. "I can change." "Maybe you can." "I hope you do, for your own sake." I took a deep breath. But I can't spend any more of my life waiting for that change, always wondering if I'm really first in my own marriage. You need to focus on healing yourself, on building healthy boundaries with your mother. And I need to focus on building the life I want. Tom slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him. "The settlement offer is fair," I finished for him. "I'll sign it, including the NDA. Not for Margaret's sake, but because I'm ready to close this chapter of my life." He nodded slowly. "I really did love you, you know." "I know. I loved you too." I stood up, smoothing my skirt. But sometimes love isn't enough if there isn't respect to go with it. After Tom left, Victoria returned with the final settlement papers. As I signed them, I felt lighter, as if I was setting down a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying. That evening, I walked through my redecorated apartment, really seeing it as mine alone for the first time. The walls were painted in soothing shades of blue and gray, the furniture arranged exactly as I wanted it. No doilies, no family photos I hadn't chosen, no traces of the Wellington family's influence. Rachel had left a bottle of champagne in the fridge with a note, "Here's to new beginnings." I poured myself a glass and stood by the window, looking out at the Cambridge evening. Students hurried past on their way to dinner or study groups, their lives moving forward just as mine was. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Hammond. "Dinner next week? I'm hosting a small gathering for some interesting people you should meet." I smiled and typed back a quick acceptance. Life in Boston would go on. Society would adjust to my new status as a divorcee, and I would build my own place in it, not as Tom Wellington's wife or Margaret's daughter-in-law, but as myself. The champagne tasted like possibility.